Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz, the godfather of football analytics and the founder of Football Outsiders. Of course, joining us as always is our producer, Justin Stein. Aaron, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about the big games last week because I thought it was an awesome week one of football. What did you think?
I thought it was great. We saw a lot of good things. We saw a lot of interesting things. We saw a lot of teams fall flat on their face. Some we expected, like Miami. Some we didn't expect, like Pittsburgh. It was a good week.
Yeah, so many interesting things. I wanted to start off just taking a look back at the games we talked about last week. So we talked about the Cowboys-Giants being a big game, and that one went like I think we expected it to. The big takeaway there, as we talked about looking into it, Kellen Moore's offense, and boy, did they look good.
Oh, yeah. It was a totally different animal with RPOs and play action and motion, and Dak Prescott looked outstanding. And everything looked outstanding. And it wasn't super run heavy, right? It was a thought that, oh no, they gave Ezekiel Elliott all that money. They're going to go back to being super run heavy, but it wasn't. It was just a really efficient, modern offense. It was really nice.
It was good stuff built, on that offensive line is always at the backbone of it. And of course, on the other side, we've got to give some credit to the Giants defense. They looked as bad as advertised.
Well, yeah. I mean, rookie cornerbacks tend to take time to learn. So that's one problem.
Yep. A lot of discombobulation there, but it was a tough matchup, and I'll be curious to see as we move ahead if Dak Prescott can continue to take that sort of Jared Goff jump.
He's going to get very paid if he takes that jump because Goff got very paid and Prescott's going to get even more paid.
All right, next game we talked about last week was the Rams against the Panthers. That was definitely a good game as it played out there. The Rams end up winning. I told you last week I was curious to find out what they would do personnel-wise with Cooper Kupp back and after the issues in the Super Bowl. And they were in 11 personnel almost the entire game. So they had 59 snaps with 3 receivers on the field. Actually, more snaps also out of 10 personnel with 4 wide receivers than out of 12 with 2 tight ends. They ran 12 plays out of 10 personnel and just 5 plays out of 12 personnel, and that includes their last 2 kneel downs of the game. So in actuality, about 4 times as much 10 personnel as the 2 tight end stuff. So interesting to see the Rams continue to go in that direction and kind of separate themselves as an outlier from the rest of the league in that sense.
And hey, they gave Tyler Higbee all that money, and then they used him more than Gerald Everett. Tyler Higbee had 5 targets. Gerald Everett had only 1. Higbee had a touchdown.
Follow the money, huh? If you're building your fantasy team, follow that money.
But, well, if you're building your fantasy team, you probably don't want any Rams tight ends. But
that's true.
I think the usage that most people were watching was Todd Gurley. And Gurley got his yardage, but he only got 14 carries and 1 target. There was so much Malcolm Brown. I wrote a little bit about this for ESPN. Looking back at teams that used 2 running backs for at least 10 attempts each in the first week of the season over the last 10 years, about 30% of those teams do both running backs end up in the fantasy top 40 at the end of the year. So even though Malcolm Brown got all that usage in week 1, I don't think he's necessarily going to get so much usage the rest of the year. But it was interesting that he was the second back and not Darrell Henderson.
Definitely interesting to see that play out. And they have some depth at that position, at least if they have to move on from Gurley. So I don't think there are any real concerns in terms of the Rams backfield, even though they put in all that money to Gurley and his health seems to be, I think he's on a pitch count, essentially.
No, I think the concern might be that Goff went only 23 for 39, which, is not a good completion rate in the modern era.
Fair enough. Let's look at the one other game that ended up being the opposite of what we expected. I told you that Tennessee was boring and Cleveland was exciting, and this game came out in every opposite way that we could have imagined. Tennessee putting up 43 points against Cleveland with just 13. What were your takeaways from this one?
Well, here's the interesting thing about this game. I know a lot of people came away from this game talking about, okay, Cleveland's offensive line is terrible. Cleveland offensive line is terrible. Cleveland's offensive line is terrible. There's some indication that the issue is Mayfield holding the ball too long, not the offensive line. Seth Walder from ESPN posted about their pass block win rate stat that they do with the NFL Next Gen Stats, saying that they had a pass block win rate of 71%, which is actually above the league average. And so Mayfield was getting sacked a lot, like from holding on to the ball too long and getting hit from holding on to the ball too long. It may have been more his fault, or the blitzes or untouched rushers, rather than the offensive line playing badly.
That's very interesting to me because that doesn't match the eye test of what I saw in this game. First thing I would point out was the penalties. 5 personal fouls in the first 20 minutes of the game, I think really kept this from being a blowout in the Browns' favor. I think the Browns outplayed the Titans over those first 20 minutes. But you have 5 first personal foul penalties. It's like every drive the Titans had, you're guaranteeing that they get at least a field goal. Every drive you have, you're guaranteeing that it goes down the toilet. So I thought they kept the Titans in the game early. And we talked last week about the tackles, Greg Robinson and Chris Hubbard there, and all the issues they had last year and their rough charting stats that they had. And then, of course, there it is, Greg Robinson, 8 penalties in 9 games last year. He proceeds to kick somebody in the face. And here's the fascinating thing. They lose Greg Robinson, and that's when their offensive line problems, I thought, really got worse. Because now all of a sudden you had Hubbard on the right side getting exposed because they can't scheme around him anymore. And Cam Wake he gets a sack fumble against him. Then he gets the safety against him. Chris Hubbard just getting abused back there. And then Greg Robinson's backup, a guy named Lamb, gets injured. So a guy that they got last week off the streets comes in at right tackle. They moved Hubbard to left tackle for the rest of the game. And then at that point, you have this mess. And I thought that's when the wheels really came off of them. So to some extent, I think it's true about Mayfield. I think he likes to hold the ball back there. It's how he likes to play. But I think what really happened in this game is it was those tackle positions. Maybe the guards in the center were making a high percentage of their block, and that distorts the statistic. I don't know exactly how that statistic works.
Yeah, it may be that. It may be that the guards in the center were holding the blocks and just the tackles weren't.
Yeah, and I mean, all you need is one, and then it got brutal. So I felt bad for Mayfield back there to an extent, but certainly he didn't do anything to help the situation as it wore on. I expect the Browns to recover. I think the good news is that over the first 20 minutes, when they had all the penalties, they really did outplay Tennessee, and I think that this will you're not going to have penalties like that in a game. You're not going to have to deal with Greg Robinson missing time. As crazy as it is to say that Greg Robinson is the most important player, to have on your offensive team when they have all these actual good players out there. But that was, I thought, what made the wheels come off in this one. And I'm curious to see if they can recover, straighten that out, and get back to doing all the things that they were really doing well early in the game as they drove down the field for a touchdown.
Here's a good way to recover. Play the other team's backup quarterback. They're playing Trevor Siemian because Sam Darnold has mononucleosis. That makes life a lot easier for the Browns this week.
Yes, that definitely helps. We will have John Verros on a little bit later, our injury expert, to get a little more information about that mono and what we can expect, how much time he can expect to miss there, because that's an unusual one for sure. All right, let's take a quick break, and then we will come back and break down this week's top games. Sports Info Solutions is excited to announce the launch of its public-facing site, SISDataHub.com. The new SIS Data Hub is free for all to use and features player pages and some of the most detailed information available. In addition to all of the standard statistics, here you'll find proprietary data collected by SIS Video Scouts, like on-target percentage for quarterbacks, directional yards per carry for running backs, and pressure rates for edge rushers. You'll also find advanced metrics calculated from all of that advanced data, like independent quarterback rating, total points earned, and total points saved, which are detailed on the glossary on the site. A pro version of the Data Hub is also available, which contains everything from the free version, as well as filters to split by situation, personnel, and almost anything else imaginable. The Data Hub Pro also includes team leaderboards, NCAA data, and the ability to download all data as CSV files. You can visit the free Data Hub at SISDataHub.com today, or you can register for a free trial of the Data Hub Pro at pro.sisdatahub.com. Coming right back in. Aaron, what is the top game of this week for playoff odds?
For playoff odds, the top game is Minnesota at Green Bay. Green Bay in 61% with a win, 35% with a loss. Minnesota 58% with a win, 31% with a loss. In a very tight division by our projections, the winner of this game becomes the clear favorite going forward. The winner becomes 2-0. if Green Bay wins, then they're 2-0 with 2-0 in the division.
Yeah. I thought last week looking at these teams, Kirk Cousins only threw the ball 10 times, and 6 of those were on play action. So that was something we were looking forward to, that play action from Kirk Cousins this year. And not a lot of passing, but 6 of those 10 throws were play action, an unsustainably high percentage. Meanwhile, on running plays for Minnesota, they had about a 2-to-1 zone to gap scheme ratio. So about 2 times as many zone runs as gap runs for them, which I think fits into what we expect from their offense, that kind of Shanahan, Kubiak scheme of zone and play action. What's interesting is that they generated a ton of yardage when they mixed in those gap concepts this week. So I'm curious to see this Minnesota offense develop this year. I think they're a real contender for the Super Bowl.
I was more interested in the Green Bay offense because there was such a question about Matt LaFleur and the personnel and stuff that he did last year. Was that more related to who he had in Tennessee or the way he likes to play? And based on this first game, I would say it was more related to the way he likes to play than the personnel, because all of a sudden the Packers are using way more 12 personnel. Marquez Valdez-Scantling only played 66% of snaps, and Geronimo Allison only played 50% of snaps, and that's their number 2 and 3 receivers. And yet you saw a lot of not only Mercedes Lewis, but Robert Tonyan. I didn't even know who Robert Tonyan was until that game. And you saw a drop in shotgun. They were 73% shotgun last year, 54% shotgun in this game, in the first game of the season. So LaFleur ran much more of his Tennessee offense than he did an offense that resembled what Mike McCarthy ran in Green Bay.
Right. And on the same point, we saw more motion than we saw from the Packers last year in this game, more pre-snap motion. And we also saw an uptick in play action that was about split the difference between Aaron Rodgers' rate last year and the Tennessee rate last year. We saw them come out kind of a blend in between of where we would have expected that one to end up. So I'm with you. Definitely looking to see how that continues to develop. And while Mike Pettine's defense looked really good against Chicago last week, I do think that Rodgers is going to have to work hard to find a better rhythm, because I don't think he established much of a rhythm in that game, obviously against a tough defense. But Minnesota's going to also do everything in their power to keep him off of the field and keep him out of rhythm. So seeing as he sort of starts to really gel into things there, I think as we get to midseason, Aaron Rodgers could be back to kind of prime of his career, Aaron Rodgers, if we're not careful around here.
He can be going back to that?
I think it's possible. I think that
it certainly didn't look like that in week 1.
It did not look good. I think it's a matter of finding the rhythm and finding the gelling. I thought that he missed on some throws. I thought that any of the criticisms that people had of Rodgers, we definitely saw that in the first game. So I agree with you there. I'm pointing out that I think as more of those concepts that I think LaFleur will be stubborn about continuing to implement, I think as we get more and more of that, I think that we could see a rhythm develop from Rodgers, and just an ease of what is being asked of him that allows him to really go back to excelling, as opposed to being the person putting the team completely on his back.
I will point out that last year the Vikings defense had the league's largest reverse gap defending shotgun plays, right? Most teams are better in shotgun. Most defenses are weaker against shotgun. But the Vikings were actually better against shotgun, 4.8 yards a play versus 5.6 when opponents had quarterback under center. So maybe this newfangled LaFleur offense is the right offense to attack Minnesota.
Fascinating point there. I love it. All right, let's take a look around. And I think you had a surprising choice for the second most important game of the week for playoff odds.
Kansas City at Oakland. Yes, that is the second most important game for playoff odds. Surprise, surprise. Kansas City is in 74% of the time if they win, 50% when they lose. Oakland, if they win this game in an upset, their playoff odds go up to 44%. They're 21% with a loss.
Yeah, I think, all the gambling stuff that's growing around us is new to me. And I'll give a shameless plug for sisbets.com on that note. But the way the public was really fading the Raiders in that game last week, I think made them a good bet. When you see that much of the public go against something, I think there was just all of the Antonio Brown sentiment. And in actuality, the Raiders kind of, I thought, had one of those come out and beat the world type games. But with the way Mahomes looked in week 1, even with no Tyreek Hill going forward, it's really hard to think that the Raiders are going to compete with the Chiefs here. Even at home, Mahomes was just so good, looking like he picked up right where he left off last year. 13 total points earned in week 1, a positive percentage of over 60%. He looks like as promising a young quarterback as we've seen in I don't know how long.
And I like Kansas City in this game too, but I think what was most impressive about Oakland was the offense in that game. No hits or sacks for Chubb and Miller, and they barely hurried Carr at all. And then Carr was actually throwing the ball downfield. His average depth of target was up from being only 7 yards in 2018 to 8.23 in week 1, which is almost league average. It's like incredibly deep for Carr. So, I mean, he had a really good week. He was 5th in DYAR. He was actually throwing the ball downfield. Tyrell Williams was a great addition.
Looks really good. Agreed.
I wouldn't be surprised if Oakland keeps this game close with offense. I mean, they're not going to stop the Kansas City offense, especially Jonathan Abram was a monster in week 1, and now he's out. And that's a terrible loss for anybody who likes fun. But I don't think they'll stop the Kansas City offense, but the Oakland offense may keep up with them. I mean, somewhat.
Yeah, interesting to see there. If in spite of all the narratives, they're actually playing football in Oakland, and they didn't have a horrible game. They went out there and they beat a team that looked a little questionable, I thought, in Denver, in a mostly sloppy game. But it'll be interesting to see if they can keep those kind of positive signs and shock the world again here. All right, next up, we've got another big division matchup. What do you have for the next most important game of the week?
Indianapolis at Tennessee. Tennessee taking a big jump in the playoff odds with that win over Cleveland, and Houston's loss to New Orleans. Tennessee now, 75% of the time they make the playoffs with a win in this game, 50% with a loss. Indianapolis, 34% of the time with a win, 13% with a loss. I think interesting, I went back and looked at last year's Indianapolis-Tennessee games, and what's interesting is the way that they worked opposite of the way most Colts games worked all year last year. The Colts last year were number 4 in DVOA run defense and number 20 in DVOA pass defense. But Derrick Henry had over 5 yards a carry in both games against the Colts, while Mariota, in the one of those 2 games that he played, had fewer than 100 yards passing.
Right, and talk about picking up where they left off. Derrick Henry with the big, long touchdown run in week 1 on the screen pass. He looks like he is right in that late season form that we saw last year. I'm skeptical about Tennessee in this one. I know this game's in Tennessee, and there's no Andrew Luck, so everybody's got their questions about Indy. So I get it, but after watching their game, I'm really skeptical about them here. We already talked about how they profited off of penalties in that game against the Browns and how that really kept them in the game. But the Colts don't have a Chris Hubbard that Cam Wake can tee off on it and just play in the backfield for the whole game. So I was concerned about some things that we saw. I don't think we could get a lot out of Tennessee establishing themselves as a great defense based on that. They certainly have continuity in the secondary, but I think that when they go against this legitimately good offensive line that Indianapolis has assembled, it's going to be a different story. And then meanwhile, on the other side of the ball, Mariota really struggles to aim the ball when he passes. We hear all offseason about Lamar Jackson and how he can't throw. I think we should start talking about Mariota and whether or not he can really throw, because aiming the ball consistently in the NFL is the most important trait that I think is going to dictate if you can play or not play. And honestly, I think we've seen enough, and I just don't think that he can do it on a consistent basis.
There was an interesting discussion I saw a couple people having on the Twitter about Mariota. Was he a bust, or is it injuries that he has declined so significantly from where he was in 2016 when he was a really good-looking young quarterback? I think that it's very possible that injuries have just hurt him so much over the years. And then, the cascade effect, you change your form in order to, because you have an injury in one place, it changes your form in another place, and that changes the way you throw. I mean, you're right. He doesn't look good. But his numbers came out pretty good against Cleveland. I mean, we don't include a lot of those penalties in DVOA, and Tennessee still had a much better game than Cleveland in the DVOA. It's not like it was even and penalties were the only difference in the game.
Right, that's true. And, I'll say one thing for Mariota, just 58% passing in low sample size in week 1. But he did take his completion percentage, just 63% over the course of the last 5 years in total. He brought that up to 69% last year. Same thing when you look at his catchable percentage, a low 70% guy most of his career. It was up at 80% last year. So this was an improved area of his game. But then we saw some of those old issues kind of resurface here, and I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to be the guy that can get them where they need to be. I think they can be a mediocre team with him. They've shown that, but I think that they're kind of capped out there.
One thing also in this game is that he needs better pass protection. I mean, pass protection is partly an offensive line stat, partly a quarterback stat, but whichever you want to blame, the Titans were last in pressure rate allowed in week 1, while the Colts were 4th in pressure rate on defense.
And flipping it ahead to looking ahead at that specific matchup, that Indianapolis against Tennessee matchup, and talking about the refereeing again, we talked about in that first game how the calls affected it. I thought the Colts were also victimized by some bad calls. They had just the first drive of the game against San Diego. They had a personal foul penalty. They got called for roughing the center because somebody's knee hit the center's helmet as he was coming through. It looked like a really bogus sort of personal foul call. Extends the opening drive of the season from a field goal to a touchdown. But I mean, looking at the Colts overall, they hung in for a close road loss against a good team in overtime. Brissett was on target for 96% of his aimed attempts. He was responsible for 10 passing total points earned, IQR of 135. I think we've got to understand he's going to take more sacks than Luck, and he won't push the ball downfield as much as Luck. But from what we saw from him overall, I go back to the matchup, and I kind of like them as a 3-point road dog at Tennessee here.
Let's talk about our last game of the week, which is not actually a top game for playoff odds because both teams have such high playoff odds. But it's the clear top game for the odds of making the Super Bowl. And honestly, this is the game of the week, NFC Championship rematch, New Orleans at the LA Rams.
Yeah, I want to start off by talking about the end of that New Orleans game. How crazy was that?
I can't beautiful, remember. First of all.
Yeah, Deshaun Watson, beautiful passes there. 2 plays. I mean, he somehow, with 50 seconds on the clock, managed to score too quickly. That's hard to do in that situation.
I mean, I don't think you slow down at that point. You need a touchdown. You take it any way you can get it, and then you got to depend on your defense. I mean, the defense did pretty good to hold them to a 58-yard field goal. You're only going to make a 58-yard field goal like 65-70% of the time. So, I mean, the defense didn't completely do its job, but they didn't let the Saints get to like a 40-yard field goal. I mean, at 58, at least you're going to miss sometimes.
Yeah, and going back, I don't think anybody would criticize Deshaun Watson's clock management there in any seriousness. I kind of say it in jest that, leaving 37 seconds on the clock there, scoring in 2 plays was too fast. But there were some people critical of Drew Brees' clock management there on that last drive, hanging on to the timeout. It ended up working out for them, of course, but, we want to look at the process rather than the outcome. What did you think of the clock management in that situation?
I think I would have used the timeout earlier and then gone with an out in the worried that they were going to run out of time. But they managed to get the short pass and get the timeout with 2 seconds left.
Yeah, I think if you look at it mathematically, people would come to the same conclusion that I think a lot of people snap to right there, which is you don't want to keep the timeout in your bag. You want to use the timeout. It's kind of like in the 9th inning, you bring your closer in a tie game because you don't want to not use that guy and have left, one of your best assets on the bench and not gone there. So I do understand wanting to use it earlier, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. But I do think it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And I think it's dangerous to question whether or not Sean Payton and Drew Brees know what they're doing. What I think it comes down to is that using your first and second timeout is very different than using that last timeout. And by keeping that last timeout in your pocket, you have this kind of game theory advantage where you force the defense to have to defend different areas of the field.
Yes.
As you saw here, when the Titans didn't defend that area of the field, Brees saw what he had there and he took it and he went for it. And just from being around them and knowing, Sean Payton and Drew Brees, they together have been thinking about clock management for 15 years, practicing it every week, practicing it every day of every training camp practice. And they take this stuff and think about it as seriously as anybody that I can imagine and as much as anybody I can imagine. So in this moment, I don't think that it was like, oh, they had a flub, they didn't use the timeout. I think that they've come to the strategic decision that, yeah, we'll use the first 2 timeouts Sure, we'll spend those ones a lot earlier, but we're going to wait until there's very little time left before we use that final timeout if we can, if we have the ball in our hands, because that's going to enable us to kind of have that fallback plan. You always want that little ace in the hole so you can use the whole field and you can navigate things. So I thought it was an interesting thing to look at there. Sorry to kind of divert the conversation to all of that.
No, they had the confidence that they could get that short pass in time to have the timeout.
It was good stuff. And then looking forward to this game in Los Angeles. This one I think is about as exciting a matchup as we can get. We certainly all remember how their NFC Championship game played out last year, and huge implications on the Super Bowl percentage chances here.
Yes, the Rams reached the Super Bowl 18.5% of the time with a win, 9.3% with a loss, so twice as many when they win. New Orleans reaches the Super Bowl 28% of the time with a win and 18% of the time with a loss.
Fascinating stuff. New Orleans getting off to the slow start reminded me of last year, the Tampa Bay game, but then they quickly got their things in order. It'll be interesting to see kind of who shows up in this game and what that can tell us about these two teams moving forward.
Two things I want to point out that I grabbed from last year's NFC Championship preview on FO. The first is the Saints' run defense was a league-low 3.6 yards a carry against 11 personnel runs last year, but they were 27th in the league in net yards per pass attempt allowed to 11 personnel passes. That's last year's stats, but obviously you don't want to allow a lot to 11 personnel passes against the Rams because they're going to pass a lot from 11 personnel. The other thing I want to point out, both of these defenses were weak against deep passes last year. That's passes that were 16 or more yards downfield. In particular, the Saints defense. But it was interesting watching Breeze. That deep pass to Ted Ginn was the only pass he had all game that went more than 20 yards in the air. Although he did have 4 passes that were technically deep passes because they went 16 or 17 yards in the air.
Right,
but it wasn't until
charting. Yep.
It wasn't. I think until that last pass to Ted Ginn in that last drive that he had one that went over 20 yards. So does he have the arm at this point in his career to take advantage of the fact that the Rams are weaker against deep passes?
And it's really funny when you look at it, because when you watch Drew, that ball was underthrown. That could have been a better thrown pass, but at the same time, hey, he made the play. It's a 40-yard gain in a third down tough situation. So you're not
absolutely. But he wasn't making deep passes in the playoff game last year either. Michael Thomas, only 36 yards receiving in that game. The big receiver in that game was Kamara with 11 catches for 96 yards.
And the crazy thing, I think, too, is that was indoors. So Drew Brees makes that throw indoors. I don't know if that pass is complete if he threw it like that outdoors. It changes the way that those balls travel in the air, especially the long distances.
I will point out that even with a loss, both of these teams would still be favored to make the playoffs because they are two of the best teams in the NFC. So that's why we said it's a Super Bowl odds game, but not a top game for playoff odds.
All right, let's take one more quick break, and we'll come back in with John Verros' injury segment.
Hi, I'm Corey March of Sports Info Solutions, and I'm here to tell you about SISBets.com. SISBets.com is an advanced prop betting information tool powered by Sports Info Solutions. Now you can leverage our proven projections model to find value against the odds. You're never more than a few clicks away from knowing which pitcher may surpass his strikeout prop, or whether your favorite running back projects to go over his rushing yards total. Just choose the type of bet, the player, and enter the money line to see the SIS Bets recommendation. That's SISBets.com.
Up next, we have a very special segment. It's John Verros, our in-house injury expert at Sports Info Solutions, in to give us the injury insights of the week. John, what do you got for us this week?
So this week we're dealing with a couple serious injuries. I think we should start off talking about Tyreek Hill, especially in the fantasy world. This is a pretty relevant injury.
Yes, now you got Sammy Watkins, so who needs Tyreek Hill? But what do you have on him?
Right, so Tyreek Hill separated the SC joint in his right shoulder during that takedown by Jalen Ramsey.
Say SC. I'm going to force you to say this word.
That would be the sternoclavicular joint.
Very nice.
And This is where the collarbone attaches to the sternum in the middle of your chest. So it's a pretty serious injury. He separated the SC joint, so it'd be a grade 3 sprain. And the Chiefs chose, even though they put him into to the hospital immediately, they chose not to put him on IR, which in my mind kind of gives us a nice timeline here. And on top of them not putting him on IR, I think it's a nice example in the past would be Danny Amendola, who in 2012 had the same exact injury where he separated the SC joint, and he went on to miss 5 games. Now, luckily, Danny came back after those 5 games and has not had a problem with the SC joint since then.
Okay, interesting stuff. So we can expect about a 5-week timeline, give or take, on Tyreek Hill. Moving around the league, what else do you got for us?
Yeah, so going over to the Chargers, Hunter Henry unfortunately fractured the tibial plateau. It was in his left knee, which is not the same knee that he tore the ACL in last season. So this is a pretty serious injury. It's basically it's a broken leg, but it's just the top part of the tibia or the lower leg. And a prognosis of 4 to 6 weeks was given to us by the team. And that's about what I would give to him as well. Things like this tend to take a little bit longer, sometimes due to just an individual's healing process. So some guys just heal quicker than others. But there is some whispers on Twitter of this being the same injury as J.J. Watt back a couple years ago, but this is not that due to a difference in severity. So J.J. had a tibial plateau fracture, but part of the bone actually was displaced or separated from the other part of the bone, and this is not the case. In fact, Hunter was able to, after this happened in like 30 seconds left in the fourth quarter in week 1, he was actually able to run off the field and finish the game in overtime. So pretty tough guy. So I'm hoping that he heals up quick, and we'll see him back in about a month and a half.
All right, so right in that 4 to 6 week time range there, definitely less severe than that Watt injury. I think that's important to straighten that out. Okay, I got to ask you about the news that came out this morning. Sam Darnold, he's going to be out with mono. I think whatever it was, the New York newspaper you were telling me said that they could kiss their season goodbye. Well, what can we expect from Sam Darnold? I had mono in high school, but I don't know if that's exactly relevant for this conversation.
No, it is. And
the Epstein-Barr virus.
Hey, good for you for knowing that. But yeah, the Jets already have ruled him out for this coming week, and they're smart to do so because mono is not something to take lightly in a contact sport. So with mono, what happens is that your spleen starts to get inflamed or enlarged. And in contact sports, any type of minor hit or getting pulled to the ground, or especially if you get hit directly on that, can lead to a splenic rupture. So you definitely don't want to put his life in jeopardy because of football.
Yeah, and feel for him. Different people have it different ways, but you could have just swelling in your kind of glands in your throat to the point where it's hard to breathe for some people, I know. And for me, it was just like having a horrible, horrible flu for like 2 weeks. So that's rough. I mean, if you're talking about a football player, the weight that he could lose, it could be something that limits him. I kind of laughed at first when I saw, okay, he's going to miss time for this. But when you really think about it, what you're saying with your spleen, you have to protect yourself and hold him out until that's back to its normal size. But also, this is painful stuff.
Yeah, it is. So they obviously already ruled him out for this coming week. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him be out for the next 2 to 3 weeks at least. And they have the Patriots next week, so that's a rough time to miss your go-to guy.
Yeah, well, they'll have to hope that Le'Veon Bell can I guess carry them in their offense. All right, John, thank you for coming on. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks.
And that'll do it for our show. Thank you to all of our listeners. Please help us spread the word about the Off the Charts Football Podcast by subscribing, rating, and writing reviews. You can also email the show at offthecharts@sportsinfosolutions.com. That's offthecharts@sportsinfosolutions.com. Any questions, any feedback you want to give about the show, we're happy to hear you there. You can hit us up on Twitter as well at sportsinfo_SIS, at FB Outsiders. And Sports Info Solutions is now also on Instagram at Sports Info Solutions on Instagram. You can check us out there. For my co-host Aaron Schatz and our producer Justin Stein, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.